Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be with you. I'm going to try to speak from the middle of the room because I think it's a little bit too distant over there. I want to tackle this topic of science and faith, friends or foes. And since I only have 20 minutes, I better keep to my script, and so I'm going to keep my script in my hand. There's been a lot of talk for a long time about the supposed conflict between science and the Christian faith. And the question is, are science and faith inevitably enemies? Are they friends or foes? Now, the answer depends a lot on what you mean by science. What I mean by science is natural science, the sorts of things that are discovered by physics and chemistry and biology and geology and cosmology and so on. And this may seem obvious to a lot of people, but if you're not careful, a lot of confusion arises because long ago the word science meant something different. In the 18th century, the word science was used just to speak about any systematic form of knowledge. After all, the Latin word scientia, from which science is derived, simply means knowledge. But today, that isn't what people mean by science. The unqualified word science today means natural science, and it is natural science that has gained the tremendous prestige that it has today because of its tremendous success in describing the natural world and in spawning the technologies that we know so well. Now, I'm not going to unpack in detail what makes science what it is, but most people realize that there are certain characteristics or strategies that science has on which its success is based. And I identify those strategies under two main headings. The first is reproducibility, that different people can get the same results if they repeat an experiment or an observation at some other place and at some other time. And the second characteristic is what I summarize by saying clarity, that science makes its descriptions have a special type of clarity, which is often represented by measurement. And so that even if the interpretation of an experiment isn't completely clear, yet at least the results are clear, so we can tell whether reproducibility has been achieved or not. If you need more details about these and other questions, please do read my book. This is the shameless advertising section of the talk. My book's an examination of scientism. Scientism is the belief that science is all the real knowledge there is. And scientism has been enormously influential in society and in the academy for probably the past couple of hundred years. Scientism is usually implicit rather than explicit. In other words, people don't generally get up and declare an allegiance to scientism. Rather, they usually just simply presuppose it implicitly. This implicit scientism is rife in the writings of the militant atheists of this century. So to give you an example, Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion, writes as follows, quote, "Did Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead? Did he himself come alive again 3 days after being crucified? There's an answer to every such question, whether or not we can discover it in practice, and it is strictly a scientific answer. The methods we should use to settle the matter would be purely and entirely scientific methods." End quote. So that's what Richard Dawkins said. But look, the resurrection is a historical claim. The way that you establish the truth of an historical claim, like the resurrection, or, for example, the claim that Julius Caesar was assassinated in the Roman Senate on the Ides of March, just a couple of days ago, 44 BC. These are not going to be, of course, not going to be purely and entirely scientific methods, as Dawkins claims they are. No, we're going to need to use methods that are appropriate to the claims being made. The evidence we seek for historical claims isn't mostly scientific evidence, it's historical evidence. It'll be predominantly documentary, perhaps personal, but maybe even eyewitness testimony. There might be some archaeological evidence, and all of this will be gathered together, taking advantage of our general understanding of what makes people tick, and of the culture and habits and practices, etc., of the time and the background history of the times in which the events occurred. Now, the reason why scientism is so important in this present discussion of science and faith is that the critics of belief in God are very fond of saying that religion is irrational because there's no evidence for God. What they're actually saying is that there's no scientific evidence for God. There's plenty of historical evidence for the claims of Christianity. I'll agree that neither history nor the truth of Christianity can be established scientifically. But my position is that science is plainly not the only route to knowledge. Scientism is simply a mistake. And so therefore, the most important clarification I believe we can make in talking about science and faith is to recognize that there are different routes to knowledge, and science is just one of them. If you artificially elevate science to become a monopoly of knowledge, then you undermine religion, yes, but you also undermine lots of other non-scientific disciplines, like philosophy, or the literature, or history, or the law, or other disciplines that you can think of, the arts. So my first answer to this question, science and faith, friends or foes, is this. Science and faith are or can be friends, but scientism and faith are intrinsically foes. Now, the idea that Christianity and science have always been at war is actually a myth. It was a myth that was deliberately championed for polemic purposes in the late 19th century. In actual fact, their relationship has been very friendly and supportive over most of history, both in history itself and in terms of their philosophical influence. And I want to offer you some evidence for that fact. First, I'm from MIT, and MIT is the high temple of science and technology in America. And as befits a high temple, we have architecture that is pseudo-Greek temple architecture. Now, complete with fluted columns. Now, if this were truly a Greek temple, at the top of the fluted columns, there would be the bacchanalian friezes of the drunken orgies of the gods. Instead of that, at the top of our fluted columns, what we have are the names engraved of the great scientists and some engineers over history. And some would say that the drunken orgies take place across the river in the frats. So a little while ago, some of us decided we'd try to make an estimate of the influence of Christians in historical science by saying, of the scientists who are written on MIT's architecture, what fraction of them were Christian? It's hard to estimate, but roughly speaking, the estimate that we came up with is 50 or 60%. Any list of the giants of science over history would include Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Boyle, Pascal, Newton, Faraday, Maxwell. And the remarkable thing about all of those giants of science, whose names I just cited, is that they were all deeply committed to Jesus Christ. So that was the first observation. The second observation to support the idea that science and faith may be friends is that I had observed personally over the years in interacting with Christians in academia that far from scientists being underrepresented amongst the ranks of those who are people of faith in the academy, they were actually overrepresented. And it was only later that I found out this is well attested by the sociological data. This is data from a book by Robert Wathner, who's a Princeton sociologist. And what it shows is that even though it is true that that academics are less likely to be Christian believers than the population at large in America, nevertheless, among people in the academy, it's not the scientists who are likely to reject a faith. It's much more likely to be people in the non-scientific disciplines. How could that possibly be the case if it is science that has somehow sundered the academy from Christianity? How could that be true? How could that be the case if it were true that the Christian church dogmatically opposed all of the dangerous innovations of science and thereby stunted the scientific development for years? And this brings us to the third point, which is think about why did science grow up in the West, in Europe predominantly, where Christian thinking held sway. And there were civilizations of comparable prosperity and stability, and in many cases technology in other countries such as China and Japan and India. Why didn't modern science grow up there? Well, a pretty good case can be made, and has been made, for the idea that far from being an atmosphere stifling to science, which is the mythical view, actually the biblical worldview of the West was, in a sense, a fertile cultural and philosophical soil in which science was able to grow and flourish. And it's been argued that it was precisely the theology of Christianity and of the Bible which created that fertile environment. The teaching that the world is a free and contingent creation of an intelligent creator, rational creator, and worthy of study on its own merits because it is good. And the belief that our own rationality as humans is in some sense in the image of God, of the Creator, and that therefore we are capable of understanding creation. These are all theological encouragements to the work of empirical science. And when intermingled with a desire to benefit humankind for charity's sake, this gave a kind of momentum to science in its early days that has gathered strength and made science what it is today, despite any of the strictures that might have taken place from a threatened religious hierarchy. And so I want to offer a bold counterclaim to this warfare myth. It is that science and Christianity are indeed already friends in a very serious sense. Modern science was germinated in and was nurtured by the biblical philosophy of creation. It was developed by largely Christian pioneers, and it continues to draw Christians to its endeavors today. Now, obviously that view is very different from the misperception that is popular, and that misperception still holds sway, I would say, in the media. In part it is because the media loves an argument. It loves a battle. A more nuanced view of the relationship between science and religion doesn't have quite the same kind of gladiatorial excitement that the portrayal as a warfare does. But you know, what troubles me more even than the media distortion of this is that a common misperception like this is often fed by well-meaning Christians. The opinion that established science and the Christian faith are at war seems to me to be promoted deliberately by an ongoing debate that suggests that somehow the incompleteness of scientific knowledge should be a cause for satisfaction on the part of Christians. I don't think that. What ought to be opposed by Christians is not science, but scientism. So let me say one or two more words about scientism, and especially what the antidote to scientism is. I believe that the key antidote to scientism is to recognize that descriptions of phenomena from different perspectives or at different levels can be simultaneously valid. This is actually a commonplace within science. But it needs also to be extended to the levels that go beyond science and into the human. There can be scientific descriptions, which, by the way, because of the methods of science, generally speaking, rule out purposeful explanations as an operational presupposition. But there can also be human, personal, and purposive explanations, all of which can be simultaneously true. So the way I like to illustrate this is by thinking about the human person, me, okay? It's true to say that I am an assembly of quarks, leptons, gluons, and photons. Yes, that's correct. I am also a combination of elements, atoms, and molecules. I am an assembly of cooperating biological cells, guided by DNA and RNA and so on. I'm a biochemical machine, powered by bioenergy. I'm an animal, a purposeful mammal with warm blood and hair. I'm a human with consciousness and intelligence, at least some intelligence. I'm a husband, a lover, a father, a teacher. I'm a sinner saved by grace, and I'm an immortal spirit loved by God. And once you set aside scientism, this improper belief that science is all the real knowledge there is, not one of these different levels contradicts the others or takes over from the others. They can all simultaneously be true, and I would argue they are simultaneously true. Now, I've said a little bit about science, and I've said a little bit about scientism and the relationship. Let me say a little bit more about faith to close. What is faith? The anti-theists of today say that you can either base your belief on evidence, or you can base them on faith in some authority. And of course, they say that their secular opinions are rational and based on evidence, while religious people are some kind of irrational faith heads. Of course, that's more of an insult than it is an argument, but nevertheless, I will concede that the religious belief of most people, certainly non-intellectuals, is founded on an acceptance, largely, of what they're taught by their religious authorities. But it's just as true that their scientific beliefs are founded on an acceptance of what they're taught by their scientific authorities. And so there's almost exact symmetry in the situation, and it's simply not the case that science is somehow based on evidence and religion on something else. In fact, both are some mixture of faith in authority and personal experience. So what is faith? Let's consider the motto of the Royal Society of London, one of the earliest scientific societies. The motto they decided to adopt was nullius in verba, Latin for on nobody's word, or I'm not going to take anybody's word for it. And according to the Royal Society website, this motto expresses, quote, the determination of fellows to withstand the domination of authority and to verify all statements by an appeal to facts determined by experiment. That's what the Royal Society website says this motto is aimed at. Now, I think nullius in verba is a very fine motto for a scientific society, even though actually it can't be carried through quite in the way that the Royal Society website says, even today in science. But the crucial question is whether that motto makes sense as a general rule for all of life. And I'd say it's impossible to verify all statements by an appeal to facts determined by experiment. And to pretend one will do so is a hopeless scientism. Incidentally, by the way, the founders of the Royal Society certainly didn't intend nullius in verba to be taken in that way, because many of them were Christians. They didn't rule out the reality of religious knowledge by any means. So here's what I say my Christian faith is and why I think it's reasonable. It's based on an assessment of many different types of reasons. Most of them are not scientific, but they are nevertheless logical and rational. The most important types of reasons for me personally, and I'm speaking about my own psychology as much as anything else for the moment, are a combination of historical evidence and personal religious experience. So my faith, I would say, is based on experience, but not the kind of certainty of reproducible scientific experiment. Still, that's not any reason to discount it. Like everyone else, I make small and large decisions all of my waking life. And that has to be done on minimal evidence beyond personal preference and impulse. And that, because after all, that's what it means to be sentient. And if history is any judge, it is the people who act boldly with determination and commitment, even in the face of risk and with incomplete information, who are successful in this world. These are men and women of action, we say. They act in accordance with a view of the world which is plausible but not proven. That is, they act on faith. And I think that my religious faith is quite simply that same type of principle applied to matters of God and the Spirit. Now, that isn't all that faith is, because Christians over the centuries have experienced by faith what they take to be a personal relationship with God. Arthur Stanley Eddington was one of the great astrophysicists of the 20th century, the discoverer of galaxies and of the internal structure of stars. And he put this personal aspect like this. In the case of our human friends, we take their existence for granted. We could read philosophical arguments designed to prove the non-existence of each other, and perhaps even be convinced by them, and then laugh together over such an odd conclusion. I think it's something of the same kind of security we should seek in our relationship with God. In summary, then, I see my Christian faith as compatible with science. Indeed, I believe there are ways in which science leads me to God. But it is not compatible with scientism because, quite frankly, that's a rival religion. Thank you very much. I'll leave it there. We're now going to have a question and answer session, discussion between the two of us, and there's then going to be an opportunity for questions from the floor. So as we're talking, if you have questions that don't get answered, get ready. There'll be plenty of time for you to ask your own.
So my job is to press you on some of these issues that you raised.
Exactly.
The harder questions.
Thank you for being with us.
That might be my pleasure. That might be on people's minds. So here's a question that immediately sprung to mind as I was listening to your talk. So imagine that we were to agree with you 100%. There's sciences, what they're telling us about the world on the one hand, and on the other hand, scientism, which is roughly telling us that science is the arbiter of all that we know and all that could be. But someone who doesn't buy into scientism could nevertheless be very impressed by science and how much progress science has made. And take a step back and say, well, gee, I mean, look at all the different areas in which science has been so successful. And doesn't it seem that when you put all these cases in which science has been so successful and stack them side by side with religion, what religion has been telling us about the world, that religion ends up looking pretty shabby in comparison. I mean, for example, religious folks will say things to the extent of, oh, you know, it was God's agency or whatever that has me believing in the reality of a personal God, and along come folks who are doing good work on the origins of religious belief, and it turns out we've got excellent reason to believe that just as bunnies are hardwired to detect the presence of hawks in the environment, and it generates a whole bunch of false positives, right? Any movement, boom, they run, even though it's not a hawk, right? The idea is that they're supposed to, this mechanism is supposed to help them survive. We also are hardwired to detect agency in the world when there really is none, hence animism and these sorts of...
Okay, so
the idea is just, religion seems to be beaten into a corner by science.
So there are really two main questions there. Let me identify them. The one question is, science just looks better than religion. It just gives us knowledge that seems more reliable. The second question is, are we hardwired to believe in religion? And is that all it is? Okay. So let me try to remind me of those two questions. But let me start with the first one, which is that science just seems like better knowledge. Actually, I'm a scientist because science does seem like extremely good knowledge. And, you know, we like to put forward the view that science is tough. It requires, you know, deliberate, hard work to master it. And, you know, the tough courses when you come to a university like the University of Vermont or anywhere, those are the scientific courses. You're going to have to work hard there. All of that is true. But actually, the reason why science has clear answers is precisely because of the questions that it chooses to ask. So that's the heart of this point about reproducibility and clarity, which is that science deliberately tries to describe the world insofar as the world is describable in ways that are reproducible and have this kind of crisp clarity that science insists upon, which very often means measurement and mathematics. So there are many important aspects of the world that possess those levels of precision and accuracy, and about those, science is unparalleled in its knowledge. And it is, by the way, those areas of the world which are the areas which give rise to technology, because after all, technology has to be something that you know works, okay? So that's one of the reasons why science and technology are so closely allied together, and science spawns technology so much. So by comparison, there are other questions which I would say are equally important, and in some cases more important, in which the methods of science don't actually work. Religion is one of them, okay? But it's not alone in being like that, because philosophical questions, or questions of history, or questions of the law, or questions of politics, are similarly fraught questions. They're questions that science can't show us the answers to, and they're questions which seem to remain controversial even after we've spent a lot of time working on them. So I just think it's in the nature of the world that there are some ways in which the world works in this reproducible way that can be described by science, and there are other ways which it doesn't. And the reason why I focus on scientism is to say that if you assert that the only real knowledge is science, you are saying that there is nothing else of interest in the whole of the world, except those things that can be described in this reproducible way, and I just think that's a mistake. So that's the first question. The second question was, are we hardwired, are our brains simply hardwired to believe? I think that it is pretty obvious to everybody that there is an impulse, there is a religious impulse in essentially everybody, in every human. So you look anywhere in the world and you see there is a kind of impulse towards a striving for reaching out to the transcendent, to God, to gods, whatever it might be. And I would certainly imagine that there are physical, biological, and other reasons that one could discover to help to identify how that mechanism, how that impulse works. But I don't think the fact of there being an impulse like that rules against or implies against religion. I mean, it's exactly what Christians would have said would be the case, you know, if God made humans and wants to have fellowship with them. I mean, Christians have always said, you know, yes, wasn't Augustine who says, you know, that the soul is restless until it finds its rest in thee. So it's always been the case, long before modern science, that people have identified that leading and considered it to be entirely consistent with a view that says God made humans and wants them to want him. That's kind of my answer to the second part of your question.
Okay. So here I've got two other questions that are on my mind. Second question that I'm hoping is going to intersect with some of the things that you think about as a physicist. So a lot of Christians have been of the mind that in order for Christianity to be true, we must possess something like robust free choice or robust free will. Or roughly speaking, this is the ability that we have to be able to choose something or not to choose that thing, where that choice is up to me, the agent. Physics, according to some, provides us with the world picture according to which that sort of power doesn't fit very easily into the picture. We've got laws of nature that don't seem to admit of the sort of flexibility, gaps in the laws of nature in which humans could exercise free choice. This sometimes gets complicated by folks adverting to what happens at the quantum level. They may say, okay, indeterminacy there, but we have no real evidence for there being substantial indeterminacy on the macro level, the level at which we would be making choices and so forth. So, as someone who works in physics, how do you think through this issue? Do you think Christianity is indeed committed to our having robust free will, and is it something that fits comfortably with the best picture that science seems to be giving us?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. Yeah, it was certainly the case in the late 17th or late 18th and early 19th century that the laws of physics looked very, very deterministic. This is the question of determinism. So determinism means, you know, you have laws of physics. Every particle is governed by the laws of physics. If you know all of the initial conditions, you can solve the equations and you can predict the future. The future is known and it's implied by the initial conditions. And certainly, if the world were indeed deterministic in that sense, it is hard to understand where free will could come in, and so on. In fact, there were people in the 19th century who abandoned religious faith because they thought that science, physics particularly, was showing that the world was deterministic and that therefore there was no free will and that there could not be freedom for there to be a God either. I would say since that time, physics has been totally transformed. You know, we'd speak about classical physics as being the physics that's based on those deterministic equations. But since that time, quantum mechanics has come along. And the way I would describe the situation with quantum mechanics is this. We as physicists and as scientists in general do our utmost to come up with deterministic equations, where the results follow from the initial conditions by virtue of the natural law, to describe the world. And we were doing that rather successfully in physics up until the beginning of the 20th century, roughly speaking. But what came up in the first quarter of the 20th century was the fact that actually the world cannot be described in this totally deterministic way. And quantum mechanics says that it can't. This was an incredible shock to the system, to every physicist, and it actually is, even to date, as far as I can tell, to every physicist who first starts tackling quantum mechanics, because it's so disorienting. Even a mind as powerful as that of Albert Einstein, who was one of the most brilliant physicists of history and also an incredibly flexible philosopher, he could not accept the idea that quantum mechanics shows that there is an irresistible indeterminacy in the equations of physics, and worked very hard to try to show that maybe that there were hidden variables that we just weren't able to access. I think it's now basically widely accepted throughout the physics community that Einstein was wrong about that there aren't hidden variables, that there is real indeterminacy, and that even though the laws of quantum mechanics are themselves determinate, what we find is they cannot describe everything about the world. So there are things that are truly random in the world. And in my business, I'm a nuclear scientist and engineer, think about radioactivity. So if you think about the decay of an individual nucleus, that is regarded as being truly undetermined. You can't predict when it's going to happen. It's going to happen truly randomly, and no one knows when it's going to happen. So that's an example of the fact that in the 20th and 21st centuries, we've actually reached the point where we've moved on from the classical physics. We now don't consider ourselves to be bound by determinacy, and maybe that leaves at least open a gap for free will. It doesn't explain free will, but it leaves at least a gap, which is what you were asking for. Let me make one final comment, and that is, you said that maybe there's indeterminacy at the quantum level, but we don't have evidence that that there's indeterminacy at the large. But we do have evidence that there's a determinacy at the large-scale level, and it's the reason why we can't predict the weather with any great accuracy over long periods of time. And that's attributable to another insight that arose largely in the 20th century, although I would argue that people like James Clerk Maxwell knew most of it in the 18th century, and that is that even the classical laws of physics, the deterministic laws that we come up with, have in some cases an extreme sensitivity to initial conditions, which mean that it doesn't matter how accurately you measure something, you can't get those initial conditions accurately enough to be able to solve the equations forwards. So I would say, in general, that looks an easier challenge to faith in the 21st century than it did at the end of the 19th century.
Here's a third question. So a lot of the issues that people who identify themselves as religious believers face is how to reconcile what science seems to be telling them and what the scriptures seem to be telling them. Most of the conflict seems to be based around the early chapters of Genesis, and as best I can tell, there are two primary issues at stake. One is the chronicle that Genesis seems to give us about the created order. We have things created in discrete kinds, in a particular order, over a particular amount of time. That seems to not sit at all well with what we've been learning from evolutionary biology. That's one part of the issue. And the second part of the issue is the advent of suffering, evils of various sorts, when I'm using that term in a broad way, in the world. There is a very natural reading of what Paul says in Romans, which says something like, look, we have death in the world, and that's due to sin. Misuse of the will. Whereas the picture that evolutionary biology seems to be giving us is no, 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 no. There's been death and predation and suffering all around long before there were any agents to misuse their will. So a straightforward reading of Romans, the Romans text, seems not to fit at all well with what we're learning about science. So 2 issues there about how to square science with the chronology that we seem to find in the Genesis narrative, and how to square science with what, say, we find in some of the New Testament books, such as Romans.
Yeah, okay. So it's tough. You put me next to a philosopher and a theologian. Okay, so I can't ask you philosophy. Let me start off by making a couple of comments about what the scientific situation is, that as I see it. It's not the case that science and religion are completely separate spheres. They never overlap. They can never argue. That's not what I'm saying. This was the position, for example, of Stephen Jay Gould, who made up this phrase "noma," non-overlapping magisteria. I don't believe in that. I think that there are ways in which science and the Christian faith mutually constrain and correct one another. So there are some claims that Christianity makes that overlap with those of science, and vice versa. And I think cosmology is an area where there has been enormous growth of scientific knowledge. In the 17th century, probably most people thought that the world was relatively young, a few thousand years old, 10,000, 6,000 years old, something like that. And I would say that today, science, physics particularly, and cosmology associated with it, shows us very clearly that the world and the universe is much, much older than that, probably billions of years. And there are very, very good reasons. I won't go into lots of detail, but almost all of physical sciences affirms that we know, affirms that the world is very old. Is that a problem for theology? That's the question, I think, that you've posed to me. Well, in a certain sense it is for the traditional interpretation, okay? But that is always an interpretation. And it was once the case, that Psalm 93 was interpreted by Christians, where it says, the Lord has established the earth firmly, that it shall not be moved. There was a time when the Christian church said, or some people in the Christian church affirmed that meant it was impossible that the earth could orbit round the sun. The sun must orbit round the earth, because it says in Psalm 93 that the earth is firmly established and cannot be moved. But of course, more open people said, well, that isn't really what it means, is it? I mean, it just means that God has made the earth, jolly strong, and we can have faith in it, okay? We don't have to worry about it, okay? So that's a place where the Christian church has changed its interpretation and recognized that a passage of Scripture was not intended to be giving a modern scientific account of, some aspect of the earth. And I would say the same thing is true about the age of the earth. It's true that if you take a literal interpretation of Genesis, that each of the days is 24 hours long, and so on and so forth, and if you add up the ages of the patriarchs and so forth, you arrive at 4004 BC as being the date of the creation. But I don't believe, and I don't think it's been common within the Christian church for hundreds of years, I don't believe that Genesis is intended to teach me science. I don't think it's a science textbook. It's a book that is intended to teach about the relationship between us creatures and the Creator. It's a book that's intended to instruct the Israelites in the context of a polytheistic and pantheistic culture that the sea is not God, the sun is not God, these are all creatures. They are creations of God. They are not gods themselves. And so I think that a faithful interpretation of Genesis that takes into account the historical context in which it was intended to be read is not to make it into a modern science textbook. It's to take it for what it was intended to be. So that's the first part, I think, of your question. I think the second part was really about theodicy, really. So if we are able to accept that the Earth is lots older than what a literal interpretation of Genesis would lead us to, what are we to make of the story of the fall, of its explanation of relationship between God and humans and God and creatures? Certainly, I think there are plenty of things within the Genesis text itself which suggests that an interpretation which said that there was no death before, Adam and Eve ate the apple. And it wasn't really an apple, as you know, if you read the Bible carefully. It was just a fruit. But we think of it as being an apple. God said on the day that you eat of it, you shall die. How did Adam know what death was if there was no death before then? Okay? There are all kinds of things internal to the Genesis text which suggest that a sort of literalistic viewpoint which said physical death entered at the fall when Adam sinned isn't the only way that one can interpret those scriptures in a faithful way, in a way that is meant to pay attention and give authority to the scriptures. I don't mean just discounting them as being, just human writings. That's not what I'm interested in doing. So I think there are internal reasons for not taking Genesis as meaning that there was not death prior to the fall. What I take Genesis to mean is that sin was the cause of the spiritual death of humans, the separation of men and women from God. That spiritual death is also actually in large measure what Paul is most concerned about. So since you related it to Paul, Paul is talking about being made alive in Christ. And when he says made alive, he's not really saying, you're starting off physically dead. He's saying you're starting off spiritually dead, and you will be made alive in Christ. So I think there are good scriptural reasons for adopting that perspective. And just finally on this one, I'm not the first person to say this. I mean, Christians have been saying this since the early church fathers. Origen and Augustine have been saying we shouldn't adopt too literalistic a view of Genesis, because if we do, we'll look foolish if people who know science or know nature better than us show us up. So that's my answer to that. Have we reached the end of our conversation? Yeah? Okay, I'm getting nods. So now, who's going to be the person who takes the mic around? If you'll excuse me, I'll stand up and I can see you. Okay? And now is your chance to ask the questions that are on your minds. Make it as tough as you can. If you'd like to ask Terence a question, that's allowable too. Okay? So who would like to ask a question? Put your hand up and someone will come to you with a mic. Yes, there's a question here.
Can you give us your scientific interpretation of miracles?
Miracles, okay. So my scientific interpretation of miracles. Well, first of all, are miracles possible in the context of natural science? My quick answer is unequivocally yes. Now, I know that there are some people, many scientists, certainly people who discount the possibility of miracles, and they think that the laws of nature, as we discover them through science, are inviolable, can never be changed. I don't believe that. I do believe that when we're doing science, as a presupposition, as an operational postulate, we take the view that the laws of nature are always there, and that they extend in the past as well as the future, and they don't change. We do make that as an operational presupposition. But the fact that we've made that operational presupposition doesn't mean that somehow God is bound by those laws and can't act in ways that are different from them. And here's the heart of what I say. It isn't the case that God has somehow set the universe going according to the laws of physics that now have sort of a life of their own, and gone on vacation, or is sitting back, or occasionally comes in and tweaks around, just to help me find a parking spot, or whatever it might be. That is not the way Christians think of God's role in creation. In the book of Hebrews it says, He upholds the universe by His word of power. So the Christian position is that God is upholding the universe at all times. And in fact, what we scientists call the laws of nature are just the usual ways that God upholds the universe. It's the way that things normally work. And that's what nature is. But because God is forever upholding the universe by His word of power, and if He didn't continue to uphold it, it would vanish, it would not exist anymore. I don't believe it's irrational to think that God can act in ways that are not precisely in accordance with the way things normally happen. Now, just to elaborate a little bit more on miracle. Sometimes we're invited to believe that, in the past, once upon a time, people were ignorant of science. They didn't know how nature really worked. And so they could believe that, that God works miracles and that unexpected things happen. But then now we know modern science, of course we know that miracles can't possibly happen. But that's not true. People in the first century knew perfectly well that people didn't rise from the dead. They knew perfectly well, that virgins don't give birth to babies. So that water doesn't turn into wine, and so on and so forth. So miracles are not something, that modern science has said is impossible. It was just as impossible, in a certain sense, for people in the first century to experience miracles as it is today. And so I think that there are many ways in which I would affirm that miracles are possible. One final thought. There's a very interesting study that just was published a couple of years ago by Craig, forgotten the name of the guy, but anyway, it's a 2-volume study of reports of miracles from around the world. And what it documents is that miracles are claimed and discussed by people all around the world. And the idea that we know that miracles don't happen, which was first, most clearly promulgated by David Hume, the philosopher, runs actually in the face of the claims of most common people in the world. And so I think we ought to take miracles seriously. I am as skeptical as the next person about, extraordinary claims, and I'll look for all of the reasons why, this might, have a perfectly natural explanation. And it's perfectly okay, I think, to look for those natural explanations. But at the same time, I think if one has a belief that God could act in the world, then it's not ruled out by science, and it's not ruled out by some kind of rational approach. So that's my rather probably too elaborate answer on miracles. Yeah. Next question. There's a question here.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you think people like Ken Ham, who defend creationism on a national scale, do you think that they do more damage for the Christian faith than they do good? Or what do you think about those people?
Okay, let's take a poll. How many of you have watched part of the Bill Nye Ken Ham debate? I'd say about a fifth of the, probably less. Okay, well, so that debate, obviously, though you probably heard about it, even if you haven't watched it. Ken Ham, first of all, to explain the reference, Ken Ham is a young Earth creationist. He believes that the Earth is about 6,000 years old, and he thinks that that is the natural interpretation of Genesis, and he believes the Bible, and so that's what he believes. I don't want to pour scorn on Ken Ham, but I do think he's ill-informed. I think he's ill-informed about his science, even though he will cite people that he calls scientists in support of him. Let me just make it perfectly clear that the overwhelming majority of professional scientists, whether they're Christians or not, think that the Earth is much older than 6,000 years. And there really isn't scientific debate about this. The evidence is extremely compelling. Is Ken Ham doing more harm than good? I actually think yes, he is. And it does bother me that many young people are being taught that they can't be serious Christians unless they take a literal view of the Old Testament, and in particular the first 11 chapters of Genesis. I mean, I think that's simply misrepresenting the case theologically and scripturally, as well as scientifically. And it is, of course, makes life kind of easier if you have a kind of literal approach to the Bible and just say, all right, well, this is what it says, so I believe it. But I don't think there is a way of approaching the Bible, or indeed any other book, that excuses you from having to interpret it. You have to interpret, because that's how language works. Language works by interpretation. And so, again, I don't want to pour scorn on the Ken Ham and his ilk, but I do think that they're doing more harm than good, and I think they provoke a reaction from the scientific community, which itself is often overblown and overstated. But it feeds this battle, and of course, the gladiatorial confrontation makes good TV, even if only a fifth of you actually watched it. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
I think that following that question, what comes out of it is a question in the mind of well, if that interpretation is subjective, then does the whole Bible become subjective? So how would you suggest walking that line?
Right. Thank you. That's a really good question. Yeah. So one of the
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry, you couldn't hear. Yeah. Thank you very much for reminding me. So the question is, if you're willing to say there's going to be interpretation of the Old Testament rule, isn't all the Bible then interpretation? And aren't you on a sort of I'm interpreting your question, but you're on a sort of slippery slope, and you're not going to believe anything, right, in the Bible? That is, of course, one of the things which encourages people to take a more literalistic view of the Bible. They don't want to be on a slippery slope to a situation in which, well, we don't believe any of the Bible, okay? Because it's all just figurative. But I don't think that's a serious worry. Well, it is a serious worry in the sense that criticism of the New Testament and Old Testament, for that matter, in the last 150 years has tended to be rather secular and actually naturalistic in the way that it's taken place. And I would criticize the scholars who have decided to interpret the Bible in this naturalistic way, in what I would call a scientistic way. They're trying to turn, in a certain sense, scriptural interpretation into a science. I think that's a big mistake. So, I think that there is some grounds for this worry that's been expressed here. But I think in the end, it's not a worry that we can escape. When Jesus said, a sower went out to sow, did he literally mean a man when he was thinking of who was describing someone to go out who went out and sowed seeds? No, he was telling a story. He was telling a parable. It was a metaphor. Okay, and so there are lots of things in the New Testament and in the Old that require interpretation, that require us to take them metaphorically. However, I believe that it's pretty much directly interpreting the New Testament in its own terms, in the terms of the way in which it was intended to the people of that time, to recognize that the New Testament is saying that Jesus rose from the dead. That's the message of the early church, that Jesus died for our sins and was raised on the third day. And the way Paul puts it is, if that's not the case, then we are all men most to be pitied. So I think there are things in the New Testament that are claimed to be historical, and that if they're not historical, then we as Christians are mistaken. But I think that they are historical. So I think that the worry that's been expressed here, a very important one, is understandable and real, but that we really can't escape the interpretive task. But the interpretive task, done sensibly, done thoughtfully, indeed leads us to a situation in which there are claims in the Bible which are to be taken literally, or historically factual, if it's an easier way to think about it. And I think the resurrection is one of them. But thank you for that very good question. I think there was a question over here. We should favour some of the people on the wings as well as in the centre.
So I guess along the same lines of the debate of Bill Nye the Science Guy and
Ken
Ham. To flip it a little bit is, to what limitation would you put the scientific method on evolution? Quick background, my academic life was in biology, physiology, so I took all the courses, particularly evolutionary courses, and the thing that always struck me was how much often what we were taught didn't strike as the scientific method, and like how you described, clarity and reproducibility. So for example, evolutionary should have a result of ever-increasing different types of animals, yet we see more of an extinction events, not necessarily human-related. That's more of a recent phenomenon, but even before humans overtook the world, lots of animals were just dying off. And particularly with the age of Earth, is there any limitation to the thought that it could be billions of years, not necessarily 6,000 years, but maybe millions of years? Like the case in point that some put up is the moon ever increasingly goes further from the Earth. So at some point, it was a certain distance at its closest, and then therefore our life as we know it would have actually a more younger starting point, and the billions of years necessary for some of the evolutionary theory to have put in place may not be there.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much for that question. So there one was a question about the age and one was a question about evolution. Let me talk a bit about evolution. Since I'm a physicist, I can talk about evolution, and you don't have to believe a thing I say about it. People mean different things by evolution. On the one hand, when we're talking about scientific evolution, evolution often is used to refer to Darwin's theory of natural selection, which says that we can explain the diversity and the adaptation of the animals and biological nature to its environment by a mechanism of the struggle for existence and the selection of advantageous survival traits. That's one meaning of evolution. Another meaning of evolution is a kind of metaphysical view of evolution, which says that people arose by random chance, unguided, and therefore God could not possibly have had anything to do with it. That is a metaphysical extrapolation of evolution. Now, obviously, I, as a Christian, don't accept the second part of that, or the second type of evolution. But I do think there's extremely good evidence that natural selection has played and still plays a role in biological processes. I mean, the reason why hospitals are such dangerous places to go these days is precisely because of natural selection, which selects for the bacteria that have resistance to the antibiotics that are so widely used in hospitals. And so hospitals are, unfortunately, a source of resistant strains of bacteria. That is natural selection at work. Now, the question for evolution in the main, the question that Darwin was addressing was, is that mechanism enough to give rise to, or to explain the species? So Darwin's book was called The Origin of Species. And he put forward the arguments that he felt that it was strong enough to explain the origin of species, and that even though, as we look around us in the world and see very different species, nevertheless, those species came from a common ancestor. This is called common descent. The evidence for common descent these days in the sciences is extremely strong and getting stronger. In Darwin's day, it wasn't all that strong. I mean, he had garnered evidence together and formed his theory based on his own observations in the field. But today, for example, the genomic understanding that we have of the differences and similarities between species is, in my view, enormously persuasive that indeed the idea of common descent, that we came from a common ancestor, is actually a scientific fact. Now, let's go back to the question of history and of evolution. Of course, it is the case that the claim concerning evolution is a little bit different from the kinds of claims that physicists usually make. So Newton says, that every particle in the universe attracts every other particle with a force which is proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. That's Newton's law of gravity. Okay, and that's something we can test, and we can actually measure. We can measure the gravitational constant, and we can do it over and over again. And if someone wants to do it next week, if they've got the resources, they can go and do it. So that's one form of scientific law, and we tend to think of that as being the characteristic, the best case, the archetype of scientific law, and it is in a certain sense. But there's another aspect of science that is addressing the generalities of the past. And the questions that we're asking when we're talking about natural history, which is another way of distinguishing it, are not, if I try and compare, hold two particles nearby, will they attract one another? But they're things like, is Darwin's mechanism of natural selection sufficient to describe the way things came to be the way they are? In other words, we're talking about natural history, the evolution in a non-technical sense, the way things changed and became what they are. And this was, by the way, this was a big point in the Ken Ham Bill Nye debate. Those of you who went to it remember he was always talking about historical science. The fact is, there is a difference in the way those things are treated in the sciences. But, and here's the point, we can be very, very sure about some things in the past because those things can be determined by reproducible observations. And one example that Bill Nye, who, by the way, I think was not as well prepared as Ken Ham in the debate. One of the things that Bill Nye said, which was right, was that, for example, we can go to the Antarctic and we can drill down and get an ice core. You can drill down, a kilometer or several kilometers and see the layers of ice that have been built up over the years. And each year you get a new layer of ice. And you can count the layers. And they have done this, and they have counted them for up to 500,000, okay? So we know that the Earth is at least 500,000 years old because we can count the ice cores, okay? And it's things like that which are reproducible observations which persuade us when we look in the heavens and other evidence that can persuade us that the Earth is old. So coming back to evolution, I reject evolutionism, metaphysical evolution. I don't think that evolution is a way to understand or rule out God. I also, by the way, am highly unpersuaded by a lot of evolutionary psychology, which I think is mostly just so storytelling. But I think that there is extremely good evidence these days for common descent, biological descent, and it's getting better all the time. But thanks for that question. Very good. There's a question at the back there.
Do you mind sharing just a little bit more on a personal level of how you came to faith? And do you mind sharing on a personal level how you came to be a Christian and when that was, and if you were a scientist, how that timeline worked?
Sure. Very briefly, I grew up in a family which was not Christians. My parents were not Christians. I went to a school that was nearby Worcester Cathedral in England. You've already detected from my accent that I'm not a native-born American. And I actually knew the Bible, and so I was exposed to Christianity. I knew the Bible a little bit. I actually studied the New Testament for a set of general education exams because it was going to round out my 10 subjects. I had 9. I thought I'd better have another one. So I thought, oh, well, what's going to be easy? Well, the New Testament. That'd be easy. It wasn't actually easy. I only squeaked by. But anyway, but I didn't believe in Christianity. It didn't seem terribly attractive to me. It seemed to be a psychological prop that I didn't feel a great deal of use for. But I went to Cambridge University, and it so happened that I met and became close friends with 2 of the students in my year who both happened to be Christians. And I found their lives attractive, and I began there, I guess in large part because of that, to take Christianity a bit more seriously. And they invited me to attend a series of lectures given by Michael Green, who's quite a well-known speaker, certainly in those days. This was a long time ago. I was an undergraduate at Cambridge University. And he was giving a series of lectures about the Christian faith and basically explained the gospel in simple and yet, and to me, what seemed to be profound terms. And I think the way I remember it, at any rate, was the most surprising things that he said that I had never thought about were, first of all, that Christianity makes sense of our world and of our universe. And I became persuaded that the theology of Christianity was intellectually viable in a deep and meaningful way. That's the first thing. And the second thing that he said was that God, through Christ, wants to have a personal relationship, wants to come and dwell in our lives and be, through his Holy Spirit, be one with us and us one with him. And that was something I'd never heard about, even though, as I say, I'd been exposed to Christianity. This was a completely new idea to me. And I became convicted, and I began to realize I pretty much believed what was being said. And so on one evening, I knelt and prayed in my room at Cambridge University and asked Jesus to be my Savior, be my Lord, and I have since then been a Christian and tried to follow him. And that experience of a personal relationship became mine and grew. And was it when I was a scientist, or did they grow together? Well, I was sort of in my second year at undergraduate studying physics and mathematics at Cambridge. And so I would say my science and my Christianity grew together. I was studying physics and mathematics, but I was also learning the faith from friends and fellow students who were part of the Christian groups there and was reading the Bible and exploring my faith. And so I would say they grew together. Next question. Yeah.
I'm just curious, what your definition of God is, immaterial being, how something that's supernatural can interact with the natural world. If the natural world is based on the cause and effect, how can something that is non-material affect something that is material?
Okay. Did you hear that question? How do I think of God? And if God is immaterial, how can the material world be affected by an immaterial God? I tried to say this a little bit when I was talking about miracles. I don't think that we certainly believe that God is transcendent, I think is a better description. That God is not limited to the natural world by any means, that God transcends the world, that God in that sense is immaterial and spiritual. But I don't think that when we say someone is immaterial, that means we're saying, that he's a ghost and therefore isn't able to move anything. I mean, that's kind of, Hollywood view of what God is, okay? So if I were to say God is immaterial, or rather transcendent, I don't for a moment think that means he's so divorced from his creation that he's unable to affect it. And so I've tried to say before that even in a world in which cause and effect are the way we describe the sequence of events. I don't think God as a cause is ruled out, either because he can be behind the material causes that we see, or because he is able to make those causes work in different ways on occasions than is the norm. I think that is a coherent position. I don't see any difficulty with it.
Looks like that's all we have time for. Can we please give Dr. Hutchinson a big round?
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.